Since we're getting close to Halloween, I thought that I would just extemporaneously tell you what I believe and have concluded happened with the publishing of The Raven and how Edgar Allan Poe's name became associated with it. First of all, it's very sad that this poem became associated with Halloween in the first place, and much sadder that it became associated with Edgar Allan Poe. It gave a totally wrong impression. And if you look on YouTube, you'll see for every one or two people that call it a grief poem, maybe 10 or 20 will call it a gothic horror poem. Well, it's not a gothic horror poem. But I'm just going to relax here and get over the jitters and just try to tell you what I've determined actually went down with this thing. The first part of the poem is literal for Mathew. I mean, he wrote from his own personal experience, as he almost always did. So Abby, his beloved soulmate, had died on March 27th of 1841. She was not at their hotel. She had been brought back to her father's home about a week earlier. We don't know exactly how that happened or why. I have my own feelings and theories about it. But in any case, she died at her parents' home on that date. And Mathew was a Stoic philosopher. He was always accustomed to hiding his real feelings, very often with humor, which is why he was a humorist, partly. And I think at first, you go through shock. I don't know how many of you have experienced deep grief, but I have. And you go through a period of shock where you can't feel anything. And being a Stoic philosopher, he probably thought he was just fine, see? And I think that he gave away just about all of her stuff. There's a letter to his brother which indicates that he wants his brother to pass along a box to the Rocks, meaning to Rocks Village, where Abby's family home was. So I think he gave away a lot of her stuff, following the Stoic philosophy that he had studied. And then when the shock wears off, it's horrific because they were soulmates. They were true soulmates. And Mathew loved her more than, I could even try to express. So he was in a very bad way. He really went through a period of insanity, temporary insanity, because the grief was just overwhelming. And he was in the long time habit of studying late at night. He believed at that time that the mark of a wise man, a sage, a scholar, was someone who had read widely and studied widely, everything he could get his hands on. So you can see how deep his scholarship was by the references that he makes over a period of 50 years. Starting at age 12 and moving on to, 1875. So from 1825 to 1875, and you can see what he was familiar with, and it's truly vast. So he would stay up late driving himself. I think he probably drank coffee, and he had insomnia. He also had dyspepsia, stomach problems. So this much was true to life. I am pretty sure there's one reference that indicates that he actually had a physical copy of the bust of Pallas, or Athena. Pallas is Athena, the goddess of wisdom. And the particular one he would have had is the one that was unearthed in Herculaneum, because he was fascinated by ancient Greece and the ancient world. And he was fascinated by Herculaneum. This much I know. So he would have had a literal bust, and that bust, I have one today actually, which I had a sculptor in Greece do for me for about $100. You can get one in alabaster, I think it is. And he would have put it over his chamber door or in a prominent place because it represented his own personal palladium, which means the statue of Athena that guarded the ancient city of Troy. And he used the word palladium many times. And it would have represented Abby, and in particular, it would have represented the esoteric, mystical, paranormal wisdom that Abby had tried to teach him. He started out being a skeptic. Very gradually, he came around. By the time she died, he was on board with it. He became a Swedenborgian, follower of Emanuel Swedenborg. And that's what that statue would have represented to him. It was Athena's wisdom guarding over his mind, see? So he would have been studying the metaphysical books that she had left, that she had left him. And she believed very definitely in life after death and in what we would call spiritualism and the paranormal, as well as deeper mysticism. And he would have been studying her books, hoping for a visitation, a spirit visitation. And later on in his life, he wrote poems and at least one short story, which indicates that he definitely did have spirit visitations from Abby. But at this early point, see, he's still a skeptic, because if you're a skeptic and you have intellectually accepted certain things about the life unseen and life after death and the continuation of life after death, still you're not convinced deep down. It only goes, to the level of the intellect at first. And Mathew was at that stage. He was intellectually convinced, but he still had that skeptic in him, see? So he desperately wanted to believe it, and he desperately wanted a spirit contact from Abby, but he was also terrified of it, see? So this is all literal. The first part of this poem is all exactly what happened. He's just telling us in very competent verse, but he's telling us what happened. And he heard something at the door, and he thought that it was possibly Abby, and he was terrified and thrilled at the same time. And he opened the door, and there was nobody there, and he heard it, and he figured, oh, it's just a bird at the window. So that was the anecdote, and Mathew loved to write from anecdotes from real life, preferably his own life. Edgar Allan Poe has none of this. Edgar Allan Poe has the philosophy of composition, in which he reverse engineered the poem and pretended to have written it. That's all he's got. That, and his wife Virginia was sick and died later on, but this is a poem about grief. This is not a poem about what people apparently call anticipatory grief, in so many words. There is no such thing. I have a master's in counseling. I know that until the second that someone dies, you can't imagine them gone. Certainly not deeply, emotionally, you can't. You have anxiety, but you don't have grief. And this poem was written in grief. So right there, it cannot possibly be Edgar Allan Poe's poem. See, I mean, how deep do you have to go into this thing? But anyway, we'll go through all the stages. So Mathew wrote this from real life. Now, after the point that he realized it was a bird, very unlikely any bird came into the room. It's possible, but if it had, it would have probably fluttered around, and it likely would not have been a raven, and it wouldn't have spoken one word, nevermore. See, so all that is now symbolic and in the realm of imagination and symbolism. What it symbolizes, the raven, is death, the finality of physical death. That it ends up perching on the bust of Pallas means that to him at that time, now remember, he's a deeply believing esoteric Christian, a Swedenborgian, but at that time, he felt as though the reality of Abby's physical death was overshadowing or conquering the wisdom that she had taught him, the wisdom of Athena. That's the symbolism of it. It's very clear to me, knowing the backstory. So Mathew had written this poem. He'd also written several others. He wrote Annabel Lee. In Annabel Lee, you will see specifically that there's a mention that his beloved was brought back, was taken away, I think it is in the poem, taken away by her highborn kin. Now, Abby's father was a marquis. Her family was aristocracy, legitimate French aristocracy. Her two sisters did come and take her back to her father's house. So that detail is literal autobiography for Mathew that happened in that poem. And Poe has nothing of that, see? So again, So also, Some Words with a Mummy was Mathew's. It was typical of Mathew's satires on quack medicine and his penchant for science fiction-ish type stories. But much earlier, we're talking probably 1830, 1831, 1832, when Mathew was writing. He was editing the New York Constellation, and he was also submitting to the New England magazine at that time, using the signature of a star and some other signatures. In one of these recent entries, I showed you that he was D, the person signing with the initial D in the constellation, because he mentions an earlier version of that same story, No Ear for Music, back in the 1825 New England Galaxy. When Mathew first started writing as a boy of 12 in 1825, that's the newspaper he first started submitting to, which was a major Boston literary journal, see? So these three poems, as near as I can tell, Mathew would have shared with Edgar Allan Poe in the first part of 1842, a matter of months after he wrote The Raven. And I'm sure that he shared it with Poe very innocently. He was gullible. He never dreamed that this person would take advantage of him. Poe, apparently, as near as I can tell, had a very nasty habit of stealing the poetry of grieving widowers. And I have reasons for saying that. I'm not going to go into all my reasons and all my evidence. It's in my paper. It's in my books. But the gist of it is that if you look at Poe's early poetry, knowing that he was not religious, he was not spiritual, he didn't believe in God, he didn't have a relationship with God, which is fine, that's his business. But a lot of his early poetry shows evidence of an author who really did love God and really did believe in God and had an active relationship with God. And one of the poems evinces spiritualist understanding. And then a later poem about grief, the same topic, shows somebody that has no idea what he's talking about, that's just making it up off the top of his head. So we know that Poe definitely was a plagiarist. He could not have written the poem that has authentic spiritualist understanding and then written this other hodgepodge of nonsense afterwards, like 3 years later. See, all that's in my paper. I've got all of the, citations and the dates and everything. But so if I look at that, and I look at how many of those poems show real devotion to God and a real relationship with God, just from that and from some other clues, I came up with a figure of about 90% of Poe's early poetry before year 1843 was not his. It was plagiarized. And a lot of it is grief poetry. So from that, I extrapolate he had to have been tricking grieving widowers into sharing their poetry, and then he might modify it a little bit, and then he would publish it as his own. Because these were not literary figures, he knew it was very unlikely, first off, that they would ever see it. And secondly, if they ever saw it, they didn't have the reputation to come after him, so nobody would believe them necessarily. So that's what Poe did with Mathew, because Mathew had written all his literary career up to that point, up to early 1842. He had written it anonymously under a whole bunch of different pseudonyms. And so, therefore, as far as Poe was concerned, he was another literary amateur. Poe didn't realize that Mathew had a more august and authentic track record in the literary field than Poe did. So he got a ringer. He got a tiger by the tail with Mathew when he imagined that Mathew was just an amateur, and he requested copies of these three works, see? Maybe others too, I don't know, but these three. So we now fast forward to 1845, the January of 1845. I'm sorry, I've got some fruit flies in here. You'll see me go like that. It's because these little tiny fruit flies up here in Maine get in the house and start buzzing me. Mathew at this time, I know how unbelievable this is. You have to understand, and I'm not trying to brag, but Mathew was a literary genius. Therefore, when people stole his work, they tended to get famous from it because it was way better than anything that they could do. And it typically was way better than anything else they had stolen from anybody else. So therefore, Mathew's work and Abby's work as well tended to make people famous. So Mathew was writing with a pseudonym, a single asterisk, a star, which he'd started using way back in 1829, I believe was the first instance. He used it for the New England magazine, for example, in 1830, 1831, 32, I think. And he was still using it when he was in New York City, and he was writing for the New York Tribune as a freelancer, apparently. And he was answering to or submitting his work to or ghostwriting for. It's really not clear what that relationship was. But his editor was Margaret Fuller. And he apparently had worked for her as an editor before on the Dial, because all of the pieces signed F in the first 2 years of the Dial were Mathew's. He periodically, I won't say frequently, but off and on, he would use his middle initial, F, or his middle name for Franklin as a signature, and he was using it in the Dial. Those were not Margaret Fuller's. That was not an F for Fuller. So when she moved to the Tribune, he apparently moved to New York and began writing under her also as a star, which was his long accustomed signature, became his go-to signature throughout his life. Off and on, he would write with the star in a number of different papers, even concurrent with his work for the New York Tribune. He wrote for one or two other newspapers as a star. See? So it was his signature. It was never Margaret Fuller's. Anyway, he was there in New York, and for one reason or another, this American Review, here is the February edition, Rebound. American Review was newly launched in January of 1845, and Mathew did have a penchant for giving new journals a housewarming gift. He had done that with the New England Magazine in 1831. I think he did that with American Review in 1845, but it didn't get published in the first edition. It got published in the February edition under a pseudonym that would have been very meaningful to Mathew. I mentioned this in the last entry. It's signed Blank Quarles. It's a reference to the British poet Francis Quarles, who was deeply religious and rather austere. And Mathew had written about Francis Quarles and offered one or two of his poems way back in 1831 and 32 for a magazine called The Essayist in Boston. So we know that he was well aware of Quarles, liked Francis Quarles, and he talks about having an antiquarian volume at that time. Well, Mathew couldn't afford antiquarian volumes of Quarles. I'm guessing it was Abby's, because she came from a wealthy family. People would give her presents. That would have been probably a Christmas present for her, see. So Mathew borrowed that volume in 1832 and wrote about it, wrote a little review about it. And then and I don't have these dates in front of me, but not too long after The Raven was published, Mathew praised Francis Quarles in the New York Tribune. I think it comes in his review of a poetry compilation by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. He mentions, I think it's Phosphor Bring the Day, I think is the title of that. It's Phosphor and Day. I think it's Phosphor Bring the Day or something like that. He praises that poem, which was included in Longfellow's poetry compilation. And that was right before The Raven was published. Now, I think that Abby was the big fan of Francis Quarles because she was really a deeply devoted Christian and austere, and I think that was her hero, poetic hero, one of them. So I think that Mathew signed with a tribute to Abby because, of course, this poem was written to her, and Blank Quarles really means Abby Quarles. Just as in Annabel Lee, originally, I think that was written to Abigail P for Poyen, Abby's maiden name. And the reason I think that is because I don't think that poem was ever intended for publication, but we can get into that a little bit later maybe. So Blank Quarles was Abby Quarles, and it was a double entendre. It was a play on words because many clues indicate to me, and not only my own inner past life memory, but also there's some objective clues that Abby was one heck of a debater. And she was smart, and she was more knowledgeable about spiritual matters than Mathew was. And she could not be beat in a debate. And she liked to debate those things. So Mathew signed the poem Blank Quarles, meaning Abby Quarles, which is, again, a double entendre. Pseudonyms were not required in American Review. If you look at the table of contents in American Review, even from the beginning, there's at least one full name and some real initials, and then there's some made-up pseudonyms, and then there's some that don't sign at all. So I think that it was not a case where Poe had to use a pseudonym, even though normally he never did use them. See, I don't think there's any instances of him using a pseudonym. He used a false name for the army, I think, or something like that, but not as pseudonyms to my knowledge. If he did, it's only one or two examples, but Matthew used them all the time. So right there, it's much more likely. And then Edgar Allan Poe, if he really wasn't spiritual and he really wasn't devotional or religious or really wasn't a Christian, which he wasn't, it's extremely unlikely that he would have admired Francis Quarles enough to use Francis Quarles' last name in a pseudonym, especially when he wasn't required to use a pseudonym. So, you can see the lack of plausibility here with Poe and the extreme plausibility for Matthew, point by point by point, over and over and over. What we're dealing with is a myth, and I'm trying to bust an urban legend. See, it doesn't really have any strength to it, any inner strength, this myth of Poe, except the power that myths have, see. So Matthew got this published in American Review, but it went into the February 2nd edition instead of the January edition. And here it is, the original. You can see it. I'll try to get it closer. Now, in the introduction, the editor of American Review mentions the humor, which is rather odd for a grief poem. See, I mean, it's got a lot of interesting elements in it. But let's see if I can find that. At the very beginning, he says, the following lines from a correspondent, besides the deep, quaint strain of the sentiment and the curious introduction of some ludicrous touches amidst the serious and impressive, as was doubtless intended by the author, and he goes on. In other words, he's noticing that this has some dark humor in it. Well, that's because the real author, Mathew Franklin Whittier, was a humorist who dealt with his deepest feelings with humor, see? It's not Edgar Allan Poe. So what happened, I think, is that Poe is a reviewer, a literary critic for this little daily newspaper. I call it a daily rag, and I'll tell you why in a minute. This little daily rag, he's the literary critic for that paper. And if I'm not mistaken, anybody can correct me if I'm wrong, but a literary critic gets advance copies, especially of newly launched journals. So the February edition of American Review comes across his desk, and he sees this poem, which he already has a physical copy of because Matthew had shared it with him in the first part of 1842. And since then, I think he'd been pretending it was his. There's some stories about Poe sharing a couple lines with this person and that person late in 1842. So he's pretending like he was working on it. So he was invested in this being his poem. So he sees it coming out, in the February edition of American Review, this one, and he has to act fast. So what he does is he scoops it. So he takes this edition of American Review and he takes his own physical handwritten copy, maybe he copies it over, and he shows it to the editor of the Evening Mirror. And he says, this is my poem. I've gotten it published in the American Review, but the editor has given us permission for us to publish it a little early, which is ridiculous. I mean, this is a really stupid lie because, I've studied a lot of these old journals. I have never seen any instance of a case where an editor would give another publication permission to scoop it like that. And especially when you're talking about a newly launched literary journal. And especially when the one doing the scooping is a little daily rag. Now, I'll tell you why I call it that disparagingly, because I got into it. You can online, you can find editions of these, and I found a whole run of the Evening Mirror on both sides of the Raven. And you look through it, and it's not a literary paper. It's a daily paper with daily news. And just to be respectable, they throw in a poem here. They might have a poem corner, or they throw in, a little story over here. But basically, it's not a literary paper at all. And for that kind of paper to get permission to scoop American Review, a newly launched literary journal, is ridiculous. It's impossible. Now, why anybody would ever buy that, I don't know. But this editor apparently bought it because Poe is there very earnestly telling him in what seems to be full sincerity, showing him the physical handwritten copy that he has, which would be convincing. And the editor goes ahead and prints it in the Evening Mirror on January 29, 1845, 2 days before it comes out in its original journal, see? And there's a little introduction that indicates that it was done with permission and so on. I don't have that in front of me. So then we find that Poe leaves the Evening Mirror very soon after that, and no reason is given. I think he got fired. I think he got fired because the shit hit the fan, and the editor of the Evening Mirror got a personal call or a very terse letter from the editor of the American Review and says, we gave no such permission. Nobody's questioning Poe's authorship because Mathew would have submitted anonymously. See, that's the key to the whole thing. Mathew very often submitted anonymously. So the editor of the American Review didn't know who actually had submitted this poem. So they all assumed that it was Edgar Allan Poe. The question was there permission to scoop or not? And there was not. And so Poe was let go, see, for lying to his editor. That's what I think happened. But then it's such a good poem that it got picked up, including by the paper that Mathew was working for, the New York Tribune. Now, there's a very interesting couple little interesting things that happen there. One of them I read in my previous entry, and that is in the weekly, where it's reprinted in the weekly. On the front page is a poem by a poet that Mathew very much admired, Macaulay, I think his name was. Macaulay or Mackay, excuse me. So anyway, there is a poem by a poet that Mathew very much admired, which I know from, previous references. And it talks about if you're going to seek fame, you have to do it honestly with integrity. Mathew may very well have caused that to be there. But also in the two readers and correspondence column, all of these newspapers had a little column by the editor in which he addressed readers and people who had submitted pieces. And he tells them yours is accepted, yours is rejected, and he might comment on some other things. Well, Horace Greeley, the editor-in-chief, makes a very strong comment that something to the effect, I wish I had it in front of me to read it, but something to the effect that no disparaging comments about another writer will be published without being signed. So by inference, I assume that Mathew tried to get Horace Greeley to write something refuting Poe's claimed authorship of The Raven. And Greeley, being afraid of getting sued because Poe was litigious, as we know, he refused to publish it unless it was signed. And Mathew was not in a position to sign. He was not in a position to publicly defend The Raven as his own for a couple reasons. One, I don't know, but I think that Mathew had promised Abby on her deathbed that he would remain anonymous because she was afraid of what fame would do to him, and she knew how talented he was. That's a guess. What I do know is that he was deeply involved in the abolitionist anti-slavery movement there in New York and deeply connected with people running the Underground Railroad. And he could not bring public attention to himself. He could not become the focus of a public controversy or a trial. Therefore, he was not in a position to defend The Raven as his own. I've been asked, why didn't he come out later? He did, apparently, to his friend, Benjamin Penhallow Shillaber, and Shillaber gently mocked him, didn't believe him. And nobody else would have believed him. And if a controversy arose about it, he would have had to go public and claim everything that he'd ever written, much of which had been claimed by other people, including A Christmas Carol, that Charles Dickens pretended to write, and quite a number of other things. Elizabeth Barrett Browning stole poetry from Mathew, 4 or 5 pieces, and published those in 1844. He would have had to claim those, and he just would have looked like a fool the way that I look like a fool now. See, in other words, it would have been the same for Mathew at the time as it is for me now. But Mathew was a real literary genius. These people were phonies. These people were scam artists. They had some ability to write, no doubt, but not on the level that Matthew was writing, not with the inspiration that Matthew had, see? And therefore, it's his inspired work that made them famous. I mean, mostly it's A Christmas Carol that people think of with regard to Charles Dickens. Mostly it's The Raven that people think of with regard to Edgar Allan Poe. And there's a reason for that, because those were inspired works and the other works were not, that those people had written or had stolen from other sources. So suddenly that poem becomes famous. And it's reprinted in the Tribune and in any number of other papers, and they've traced, exactly what papers, printed it at what times. And Poe becomes famous based on that poem. There's more history with regards to Some Words with a Mummy. There's more history with regards to Annabel Lee, which I don't think I'll go into. I don't have it at the, top of my head as much as I do concerning The Raven. The gist of Annabel Lee is that Poe never published it during his lifetime. If he had it, and this is like one of the poems he's famous for, after The Raven, that's his most famous poem. Some people like it better. If he had that from early 1842, why didn't he publish it? He didn't. The only answer I can think of is that Matthew said, okay, you tricked me with regard to The Raven, but I can prove that Annabel Lee was originally my poem written to Abigail P. And it was deeply personal. This is about the death of my wife. If you dare to publish this poem, I will expose you, no matter what the consequences. That's what Matthew would have told Poe. And Poe was afraid to do it because he knew that Matthew was serious about that one. Apparently, toward the end of his life, right before he died, he was preparing to submit Annabel Lee for publication. And they say that the only copies of Annabel Lee are written out for submission. See, in other words, there's no original. Well, there's no original because the original was in Matthew's hand and Poe would have destroyed it. See, he didn't write that poem. All he did was come up with a Southern name. Instead of Abigail P., he called it Annabel Lee. And there are some stories about how Annabel Lee supposedly was written, which are just myth. They're just urban legend. They're not real. And then there's more with regards to Some Words with a Mummy. But for that story, all you have to do is look at Matthew's other productions, which obviously I can't show you here, but I have them all digitized and all, mostly photographed and all digitized. I've got physical copies of quite a few of them. And if you look at Matthew's productions and his satires on quack medicine and his science fiction type works going back to 1830, 31, 32, you will find that this is far more typical in style for Mathew Franklin Whittier than it would be for Edgar Allan Poe. So I'm trying to think if I've left anything out. That's the gist of it. I call it identity theft. Poe simply, by sleight of hand, jumped in and publicly scooped Matthew in a little daily rag by 2 days. And because of that, his name was attached to it. He was assumed to be the author because he was a sociopath. And a sociopath tells the big lie. It would take real brass balls to pull off a thing like this. I mean, you have to acknowledge that. Only a real sociopath has those kind of brass balls, willing to actually, first off, he must have realized that Matthew could not defend himself. How he learned that, I don't know, but he learned through the grapevine that Matthew was reclusive and that he was involved in some secretive work and that he would not defend himself. And then he pulled off this scam and it stuck. And then Poe just played the part. And when it looked like it might not be holding, when it looked like people, I think, were starting to question, this guy couldn't have written this poem. He's not deep enough. He's not a good enough poet to have written this. So Poe had to act fast once again. And what he did was to write an essay called The Philosophy of Composition, where he reverse engineered the poem and pretended to have written it in a very, one person called it a methodical manner. I call it pieces parts, like Legos. He claims to have written it in pieces parts. It's impossible. He couldn't have written that poem in pieces parts. So other people have said, oh, he was joking. It was a parody, but it wasn't. What would it be a parody of? because that's the way Poe actually wrote his poetry. See, in Pieces Parts, was he making a parody of himself? No, he was like a psychopath laughing at the police and toying with the police and laughing up his sleeve, as they used to say back in the day. See, that's, I mean, in that sense, he was joking, but only in that sense. He was joking because he was fooling everybody as he pretended to have written the poem. And his explanation is so childish, and yet he fooled everybody because of the power of that myth. That, I think, is really the gist of it, It's impossible. Again, Edgar Allan Poe could not possibly have written The Raven. And when people say, oh, I've studied this for years, I've studied this for 10 years or 30 years or however long, they're experts. But they're experts on the myth. They're not experts on the reality. It's like a fundamentalist preacher who has studied the gospel from his interpretation of it for 40 years, like somebody like Billy Graham, is an expert on Christianity. Well, he's not. He's an expert on fundamentalist myth, and that's the level of understanding that these experts about The Raven and Edgar Allan Poe have. They're not going to be happy to have this lack of real understanding exposed because it knocks them down off their pedestal. These people, have an ego about being experts, and they're heads of organizations and clubs and associations, and they're editors of journals, and they're important people in that realm, and they're all dead wrong. All they have is an urban myth, an urban legend, and it's just wrong. So I expect a lot of resistance. The resistance I have now is to be ignored. Very rarely, occasionally, somebody will agree with me, but just with like a little comment on a video or a little like or a little heart or something, or they'll say, thanks for letting me know about this. I'll look into it. And I never hear from them again, because they realize this is dynamite. This is serious shit here. I don't want to get involved in this, because anybody in academia, as soon as they come out in favor of this, they're going to be out. They're going to be shunned by all of their colleagues. They won't be able to get grants. They won't be able to get published. No students will want to work with them, and they'll be out. They'll be washing dishes very soon. See, and they know it. And yet, there's got to be people that read my paper and they say, this is real. This is actual. He's found the real author of The Raven, which I have. That it happens to have been myself in a past life. Well, here's the thing. I am Mathew in a way. I have the same higher mind. I'm pretty much the same ability to write, at least prose anyway, at least blogs, a little bit poetry, I have the same sense of humor. Basically, my mind works the same way, and I have all the same emotions. So I can feel everything, that Mathew felt when he wrote The Raven. If I let myself, if I let it get to me, I can. But I'm not the same personality. I don't have the same physical personality. I'm not the same person. Obviously, I'm not the same physical person, although I look similar, about 85, 90% similar. My personality is rather similar, but I'm not the same person. So I don't think I really quite have Mathew's talent full blown, because Mathew was like, he just sparked ideas. He's one of these people. He was not as grounded as I am. He was more mercurial and not as emotionally mature, but he just sparked ideas like this. Tremendous creativity. Well, I think that I'm more grounded and more solid and not quite as brilliant as he was, I would say. I still have the depth of insight, which is what's underneath his brilliance. See, that's the difference between real inspired work and just somebody that's just smart and can spin stuff. Well, I still have the same depth of insight, but I don't think I have quite his intellectual engine, maybe close. But so I can't say that I wrote The Raven. I can say that my past life incarnation definitely wrote it. And how much of a feather in my cap that is, I don't know. It's not my concern. I'm not a megalomaniac. That's not what I'm after. I'm after reconstructing and reclaiming Mathew Franklin Whittier and Abby Poyen Whittier's legacy before I pass on, and preserving it in some way in a little library or museum, or if worse comes to worse, at least a collection in a larger museum. But I'd hope to have, a museum specifically dedicated to their work, a little one. It's not that much material, but a little place where people can go and see the things, the physical copies, and access all the digital works and study his works and compare them, and maybe look at some of these blogs. Maybe people could come in and check out a little booth, and go in and watch one of these blogs to, see me actually showing them, the past life author of the Raven is now showing you a physical copy of the journal that he submitted it to under blank Quarles, which stood for Abby Quarles. See, that's got to be worth something someday to people in the future who actually understand that this is real. So thank you for watching. I won't say happy Halloween because I'm not a big fan of Halloween. They do it up big around here in the neighborhood where I am. There's all kind of displays, more so than Christmas, I would have to say. But to me, it's just, death is not that much of a mystery to me, at least intellectually. I understand it's like a cicada. You see a cicada clinging to the tree, and the old shell is left there, and the brand new, fresh, newly molted cicada pops out of it, and he flies off. That thing that's sitting on the bark, it's neither dead nor alive. You can't say it's dead because he's gone, see? And you can't say it's alive, so it's neither dead nor alive. It's just a shell, okay? That's death. So I don't have this terror of death that would prompt me to kind of be fascinated by Halloween and, all these skeletal dogs and skeletal, goblins and various things that people put in their yards, it kind of leaves me cold. But I will get back and do this same thing with A Christmas Carol when we get a little closer to Christmas time.